Welcome to the View from the Penalty Box podcast with Cam Connor. Classic hockey stories from one of hockey's toughest enforcers.
Episode 5, exciting. I'm Cam Connor and my son Chris Connor.
So, Dad, we're in episode 5. That's about 4 more episodes than you thought we'd end up recording. So how do you feel 5 episodes in?
I plead the fifth. I don't really... This is kind of a... It's interesting to reminisce, but we still probably got another 5 or 10 more to go before we're all done. But I'm committed.
We won't be done. We have other things to talk about. We have interviews we could do. There's lots to do. I know it's a lot of work to think about, to place yourself back 30, 40 years ago. And the topic of today's episode brings you back, what would that be? 30, 89, 99, probably like 40 years ago.
Right.
Where we're talking about your time with the Montreal Canadiens. And it's an interesting time because it's kind of the end of the dynasty years where you got to play a big part in especially one game. So we'll talk about the double overtime goal that you scored. So that's the main topic for today. But I thought we could talk a little bit about the challenge that we do every year. I know we missed last year, but we play tennis every year. And we will say maybe 15 years in a row, my dad has won. He's in his 60s. I'm in my 30s.
No, that's 15 out of 15 years in a row.
But I'd like to say that he cheats. And he has cheap shots, and I don't even know what you would call these shots, where you hit the ball up in the air as high as possible, like a moon ball, and the bounces over my head practically. So I wouldn't call it tennis, but he does win the point.
Chris, it's many, many years of developing that trick shot, plus my serve. I put a little spin on it. I used to be a baseball pitcher, so I developed... like everybody else, I learned how to throw a drop ball, a curve ball, a rising ball. And so it's just a matter of having the same kind of technique, putting spins on it when I serve. And Chris thinks it's going to land in front of him, and it jumps over about a yard or two to the left or right.
So it's not a fun game to play because
you're losing.
Yeah. So anyways, we'll keep you all posted in terms of who wins. There's still a bit of nice weather where we are, so we're going to try and get a game in soon, and we'll keep you posted. Hopefully I can break the streak. I hope I don't have to wait till you're 90 to beat you, but
I hope I live to 90.
So we have a question from last week's podcast that was really well received, the Roddy Piper Part 2 episode. And the story, people like the Roddy Piper stuff, but they really enjoyed the John Cena story. And so we have someone from Twitter that's actually a really big supporter of our podcast, who goes by the handle Blue Collar, Blue Shirts. You know him, right, Dad?
Correct.
And so he listened to the John Cena story where he tried to kick the crap out of you, or at least threatens you. And he wonders if Roddy Piper was in on this, like it was a rib. Do you think that maybe that was the case, that he got Cena riled up? And I actually never thought of that, but that's a good question.
Well, just by the way Rod reacted, the way I reacted, I don't believe Rod was in on this, because Rod couldn't keep a secret. He would have let me know later, that he got Cena to do this. But again, after watching Cena on TV with the Bellas, he acts like a real gentleman, and he's a classy guy, wears a suit and tie. That's not the John Cena I saw behind the scenes, so I think he traumatized me, but I don't think Piper was on it.
Okay, well, that's
on it.
Yeah, it's still an interesting story. I guess we'll never know unless you run into John Cena again.
I don't plan on it.
Yeah. So we've had a lot of people who've asked for some current stories and insight from you. So I know one of your friends is in the news lately and is the GM of the Las Vegas Golden Knights team. And that's a really interesting team. And so the GM's name is George McPhee, who you played with in New York and actually a few other teams. And I know you have a lot of interesting things to say. So can you share a story or two about George McPhee, and then maybe what you think the Vegas team's prospects are?
Okay. Well, I met George McPhee when he first joined. Let me back this up. He came out of Bowling Green College. He ended up winning the Hobie Baker Award, and he got a business degree while at Bowling Green. He was with the Rangers, and he got sent to the farm team, and I'm still with the big team. And I had a friend of mine on the farm team as well named Mike Backman. And Mike called me in New York one day, and he said, Cam, we've got this guy named George McPhee from the farm team that's been in the hospital in New York City for maybe, I think he said 2 or 3 weeks in traction, and not one of the Ranger players or management has even gone up to say hello to the guy. He doesn't know anybody. He's just sitting there. Would you go up and say hello to him? So, by all means.
Which you did mention this last week.
Yeah,
so,
that's right. That's right. And so, when I went up to see George, that's the first time I met him. And it's pretty weird talking to a guy you've never met before who's all strung out with weights on his legs and is stretching his back out. But George is quite a character. So that's where I first got to meet George, and we told some stories back and forth. And
how would you describe his personality? Because he comes across really intelligent and pretty serious.
Well, he has that side to him, but, he's a GM now, and I think that's the side you got to portray. But George also has another side where he's a lot of fun, and he'll make you laugh by being George. And that's the guy that I know the best.
And what kind of a player was he? I never got to watch him, that I remember.
Well, George, he was 5'9" and 170 pounds. He wasn't somebody that had big arms or, was going to intimidate you at 170. But he really didn't know he was 170 pounds. He played like he was over 200 pounds. And he had a lot of balls, that guy. He'd show up and fight all the tough guys, and he could play hockey. But the old guys that are bigger than him and didn't know George, it's the old story. You reach for a rabbit and you grab a bear. All of a sudden they're in a fight with George and they go, oh my God, I didn't know this guy was that tough by just looking at him. George, when when I first met him up in the hospital, one of the things he told me, he said, man, this New York City's crazy. So I think what it was, if I remember correctly, that towards the end of his stay in the hospital, I think they let him out of traction a little bit to move around, and then they put him back into this traction position. But when he was up, he said he went and looked out the window and he heard a bunch of noise, and actually what it was, there was a gunfight going on in New York City just below his hospital window. So he was watching that and he just said, wow, New York City, I don't know if the rest of the city's like this, but I just saw a gunfight. And
you actually, since we do lots of tangents, you actually saw a mob hit, or something to do with the mob hit, right, when you were in New York?
Yes, I did actually. I didn't see the mob hit itself, but I got there about 30 seconds later. When I finished hockey, I started working in Midtown Manhattan in the computer consulting industry, which I was in for 25 years. And I was leaving work at about 5:30, heading to Grand Central Station. And the New York City blocks, like if you live in Canada and you go to Toronto or Calgary, Edmonton, the city blocks are about half the size of a New York City block. So I was walking to the end of the block, and there was Paul Castellano, who was the head of the mob in New York City, laying there with his bodyguard. He had the two of them had just been shot in front of a restaurant called Sparks. And again, that was about a 30-second walk from my office. The cops hadn't got there yet. So I just see these two guys laying in the street. And when I read John Gotti's book, John Gotti had said that him and his henchman, Sonny Bravado or something, were sitting across the street watching all this unfold. And that they actually had three guys on three different corners of the street in yellow raincoats. And the reason for that is that if the Paul Castellano got by the first guy, couldn't get him, he had to go by the second guy on the next corner. And if that guy didn't meet him, he had to turn right down a one-way. There was another guy. And the reason he had them all in yellow raincoats is because he said when you go to identify these guys, what are you going to say? Well, they were wearing yellow raincoats, so there's really no description. So I did see the aftermath out of that for sure.
So that kind of confirms what George was thinking back then, that New York City's crazy. At least in the 80s it was.
Yeah, I think it's cleaned up quite a bit today.
So back to George.
Yeah. Well, again, with George, he played in the Ranger organization, I want to say, about 5 years. They didn't really give him a chance. There was a guy named Craig Patrick, the GM, and George really, he was a good hockey player, but you just need somebody to give you a chance and give you a little ice time and let you work the kinks out. George didn't get that chance until one year there was training camp, and they took on the New Jersey Devils, and there was a fellow by the name of Scott Stevens. And I think anybody who's followed hockey would know who Scott Stevens is. He's 6'2" and about 215, 220 pounds. A hard-nosed hitting hockey player. Like, you better keep your head up because he knocked the Lindros out. He hurt a lot of guys at center ice when you're carrying the puck and you have your head down. And he was a really good fighter. So the exhibition match, George, and George, like I said, he played like he was over 200 pounds. And Scott Stevens bang into each other. And they must have fought, and I don't think I'm exaggerating, for a good 3 minutes straight. Boom, 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 boom. Both of them punching each other. And George didn't back down one little bit. When he'd finished that fight, Scott knew he was in a fight. And George represented himself and the Rangers very well. By him standing up to Scott Stevens and not just throwing a couple and hanging on, he fought him like a man. That was the beginning of him on the Ranger team. And I think he put in 50 games that year with the Rangers. But more or less over 5 years, they had him coming up and down, with the Rangers. George, he always... I got to know him. I got sent to the farm team in Tulsa, and so George and I and some other guys would hang out, and he'd come over, like I remember, for Thanksgiving, and we'd go to concerts together, and we'd go out for beer, and very intelligent person, there's no doubt about it. So when he went to Bowling Green, he won the Hobie Baker Award, which is quite an honor, and he got his business degree there, as I said, and he also always said, I want to be a GM. I want to be a GM. So one day, I looked in the paper, and he was like assistant GM for the Vancouver Canucks. And I got a hold of him. I said, George, how'd you get there? And he calls me Cammy. He said, I'd like to go out. When I lived in New York City, he was single. He said, but I always wanted to be a GM. And I went through hell for 2 years. He said, I didn't come out of my apartment. He said, I paid a price. He said, every night I just did, his schoolwork. And so, anyways, he went to Princeton University, and after 2 years, he got his law degree. And that opened the door. So he has his business, now his law degree, well-educated guy. And so he started off with Vancouver, and then I think he went directly to Washington. And I just actually Googled George today, and I think it said he was there in that organization for 17 years. George is a smart cookie, a tough boy. He kind of has it all.
And you actually just connected with him over the summer through email. So it'd be interesting if we could maybe get him on the podcast one day. I'm sure he's very busy, but you never know.
No, you never know, for sure. I have to track him down. We'd have to maybe do a little bit of emailing and see if the timing is right.
So with him as the GM, what do you think the Vegas team's prospects are?
I think if you follow hockey, you follow George's draft. And George was pretty crafty. Each team had players that they couldn't protect, but they really wanted to keep. And if you want George to leave your guys alone that you don't protect, you got to make a deal with them. So George wasn't out to make friends with the other GMs. He's out there to put the best team on ice that he can. And, when you're in that market like Las Vegas, you talk to people. Is it going to make it? Nobody really knows what the future is. Is it going to be another Phoenix? Don't know. So George's job is to put a good hockey team on year one. And I think his goal is to, for sure, get in the playoffs. I think he's got enough quality players. I think he's probably got the best team ever for an expansion squad, starting with no players. And when you pick a team, as most people know, you got to find the very best goalie you can. And he's got Fleury in net, which he came from Pittsburgh. He's a hell of a goalie. He showed what he could do in the playoffs. His regular season last year wasn't his best, but he rose to the occasion in the playoffs. And if Fleury can continue where he left off last year, there is no doubt that George is going to have a team that gets in the playoffs his first year.
So you're predicting playoffs?
I do. And I think he's also, when you look at some of the guys on his team, I think he's got, it's not a matter of, I played in the World Hockey for a guy named Stanley Huckle. It was in Phoenix, the most boring game to watch. We made the playoffs, but he told us, unless you have over a 90% chance when you go on the other team's end to get the puck, just peel back and pick up your winger. Okay, we won hockey games, but we didn't sell the game of hockey. Like, he missed the boat on that. Hockey is an exciting sport, and you should put the players on the ice that can entertain and win hockey games. That's what I think George has done. Is you can make the playoffs, but you got to entertain. That's what it's all about. And George is smart enough to know that it's more than just getting into the playoffs.
Well, it would be interesting to see what your Twitter followers think. So send my dad a tweet at CamConnorNHL and let us know if you agree that Vegas will make the playoffs, because that's a bold prediction for a team in the first year.
It is.
Okay, so thanks for all that. Now we're going to go to the main topic, which is Montreal Canadiens 78-79 when you played for them, probably a highlight of your career. I know that in, I think, episode 1, you talked about one of your biggest regrets, which was going to the WHA instead of directly to the Montreal Canadiens because you were a number 1 draft choice, 5th overall. So let's talk about why you decided or how you ended up back in the Montreal Canadiens. Give a little bit of context to how amazing this team was, this dynasty team that you joined.
Okay, well, let's start off. How did I end up back in that organization? So I went to Phoenix Roadrunners, signed a 5-year deal, and that team ended up folding, I think, its 3rd season. So I went to Houston Aeros from there, and I signed a 7-year, no-cut, no-trade contract, and they folded after 2 years. So now I've got a total of 12 years worth of contracts in 4 years with the World Hockey, and both of the teams I played for folded. At the end of the year, all of Houston Aeros hockey players were sold to the Winnipeg Jets. I am from Winnipeg, and but it's the WHA. And so they offered me more money and a 5-year contract, as Montreal did. But I just said, okay, if I'm going to stay in the World Hockey and I'm going to Winnipeg, I have got to get a guaranteed 5 years. Because if they fold on me or they're not invited into the National Hockey League, now what? So they said they wanted me on the team, but they couldn't guarantee me a 5-year contract. So I went to Montreal Canadiens for less money. And actually, I couldn't have gone wrong that year because the Winnipeg Jets won the AFCO Cup and Montreal Canadiens won the Stanley Cups. But I'll take a Stanley Cup any day.
So when you say you went to Montreal, how did that conversation happen? And were they upset that you didn't go to them in the first place?
Well, it was interesting. I think they were a little upset because I got some phone calls from Scotty Bowman, and he was trying to talk me into when I was just out of junior to play for them. But I gave the World Hockey my word. I couldn't go back on my word. Yeah, they were upset. And the reason with Montreal, there was some legal problems because Winnipeg Jets, they said, oh, no, he was sold as part of the assets, so he's got to come here to Winnipeg. And my argument was I had a no-cut, no-trade, so I'm a free agent. And so Montreal couldn't sign me right away, and there was a little bit of a lawsuit going on, and that's really why I started the season late with Montreal, because this lawsuit hadn't quite worked itself out yet. So actually Montreal Canadiens told my wife and I, and we were living in Houston, kind of in limbo, and we traditionally would go back to Winnipeg for the summer. But Montreal Canadiens said, don't go back to Winnipeg. We don't want you in Winnipeg, because I guess they felt that the ownership of the Winnipeg Jets could easily get a hold of me and invite me over to their house for dinner and talk me into signing with them. But they obviously don't know me. Again, a handshake and my word is my word. So what they told me is that summer, that the wife and I, they would pay for 2 months. We could go anywhere we wanted in the world. Just stay out of Winnipeg, and Montreal Canadiens would pay the shot. I didn't take them up on this because I was wondering how I could train properly when I'm out sightseeing in the various countries. So I would kind of regret it, but I had to do what was best for me, and so that's the reason I end up going to Montreal.
What did Mom think of you turning down that trip?
Well, she tried to talk me into, well, Cam, I know you'll work out, but I just knew me. I had to be in a certain environment in order to show up in shape. Yep.
And so when you joined the team, how did you feel? Were you intimidated? How did they receive you, especially knowing that you chose not to join their team?
Well, again, the players are the players. They go ahead and play whether you're on the team or not, and you just do the best you can. So players, they didn't care. They didn't hold it against me. They never even brought it up. Once I'm there, Bowman doesn't bring it up. So it was really a non-issue that I didn't play for him before. I do remember going to training camp with all of these well-known hockey players in the first, because I came from Texas, so I remember the first day. I wore this cowboy outfit. It was leather and blue jeans with a cowboy hat. And so I didn't try to make an impression, but that's kind of how I walked around some days in Houston. So anyways, the boys got a kick out of that. And so, you go through all your strength tests and your medical and so on. And my blood pressure has always been high. Ever since I was like 20 years old, it's been off the charts. So the team orthopedic surgeon, he was taking my blood pressure and he said, wow, this is really high. Come back in half hour. And I came back in half hour. Oh, it's still high. Come back a little later. And I came back and he said, still high. He said, is it so high because you're just excited to be here with like Lafleur and Gainey and Robinson and these guys? I said, I don't know, maybe. But I didn't tell him I've always had high blood pressure. So that was training camp. But, just to talk about it in the early days, for me, when I look back in the seasons that I played well, even in junior, the kind of coach I need is the one that pats you on the back, not cuts you up. And then back in my day, when I played, the management, they were in charge and they were the bosses, and the players, they had either the NHL or WHA, and there wasn't many guys going over to Europe then. Today, with their salaries, these coaches are a lot more down to earth and they're more player friendly. And Bowman, he was on my case like you wouldn't believe the first 2 weeks. He was nasty to me. I remember Steve Shutt coming up to me and he said, Cam, I think he'd been there already 7 or 8 years. And he said, he's bad to everybody. He's nasty with them all. So I said, okay, I don't feel as bad. He said, but I got to tell you, he's treated you the worst out of anybody. And why? I don't really know. I really don't know. So I remember after first 2 weeks after practice, Toe Blake was in the hospital. And he used to coach the Canadiens. So he didn't know me, and I went up to found out what hospital he was in, and I went up to his room and I came in and I introduced myself to him. I said, Toe, you don't know me. And he said, oh, I do know you, Cam. He says, you're a good hockey player. And he gave me some compliments. And I remember saying to Toe, I got to ask you one question. Do you have to be a prick to coach? And his words were, yeah, you do, Cam. So I think that's the way it was with the Canadiens when there were 6 teams and the players didn't have a choice. They ruled by fear and by yelling and through negative.
Well, it's funny you mention that because I have a quote ready for you from Steve Shutt, and he talks about Scotty Bowman, and it actually has to do with how tough he was. And so he said, the strangest thing with Scotty would be that the farther ahead we were in the game, the more agitated he'd become. If we were playing a tight 2-1 game, he kept quiet and didn't say anything. But if we were up 4 or 5 goals, he'd go crazy. He'd be screaming at us to stay on them, not to goof off and let the other team into the game. And that was from Steve Shutt. Does that sound familiar?
Oh, yeah, but it's even deeper than that. Like I said, it's funny. There's double standards in everything in life. And so, if somebody like Cornway or Lafleur or one of these 9 Hall of Famers made a mistake, Scotty, he knew better than say anything to them and criticize them. But if I made a mistake, you just think I shot somebody with a bazooka. He was just nasty with me. So I don't play well for people like that. I just don't. I'll do my best and I'll work hard, but I'm just spinning my wheels out there. So when I look back at my year in Montreal, I certainly didn't play with confidence. And I don't think Scotty, for me, was the right coach. When you look at a guy from junior, Patty Janelle, when I had a super year, he gave me a pats on the back. He gave me confidence. And that's what my buddy Roddy Piper did. He'd always be making me feel like I was somebody good and somebody positive. And that's how you need to coach a guy. You can't coach everybody, paint them all with the same brush. Because you had a guy like Pierre LaRouche on our team that year. He scored 50 goals twice with 2 different teams. And he was a good hockey player, a natural talent. And you can scream and yell at him to pick it up. And it wouldn't take away his confidence one little bit. He'd skate a little harder in practice. But for me, that's not how you got the most out of me. So I think coaches out there, you got to realize, what you have in a player, whether it's somebody you've got to push or somebody you got to pull. And so I was off to a bad start with Bowman for sure.
And I think that's a good topic for an upcoming podcast, is just talking about all the different coaches that you had. We had Glenn Sather.
Right? I've had Fred Shiro. I've had some good coaches. You're right.
I'm holding on to a Fred Shiro story that I know my dad won't be able to get through without crying. So if you want to hear him cry, I'll keep you posted.
That's about another guy at the rink that I usually get all choked up. But Freddie, that's a pretty funny story.
Okay, so yeah, we'll talk about coaches another time. So why don't we talk about the different players? Well, why don't we start with Guy Lafleur?
Well, fair enough. And I've had a few concussions playing in the National Hockey League, from elbows to the head to pucks in the head, and it takes me a while to get set up for these podcasts. I've got to write things down, and then I got to redo it, and then when I'm all done, then I say, I remember another story. And so it's a little bit of an effort, but so some of these things are not in order, but I'll just talk about the different bullets that I put down. When I think about Guy Lafleur, outside of, say, Gordie Howe, and, you can't take away from Wayne Gretzky, a class act, Guy was one of my favorites by far. What I like about him is some of the teams I played on, when they had some really good finesse players, and if I got rough out there, I remember, and I won't name names, they'd come back to the bench and they'd say to the coach, so-and-so speared me, or they did this, can you get Cam after him, can you do this? And I used to get pissed off when I hear that. They're getting all the ice time, and maybe that was just my role, I don't think so. But with Lafleur, I remember one time we were in the shower after playing the Bruins in the playoffs. I think we had him 6 games in a row. And I looked at his upper body was full of like red marks. And I said, Guy, what happened to you? And matter of fact, he said, the Boston Bruin players, they slashed me and speared me. And with Guy, he never took one step backwards. He never complained. He didn't let that throw his game off. And that's the same with Cornway and all those great Canadians. Back in 79, 80, and all the 70s, the Flyers had the Broad Street Bullies, and they ruled by intimidation. And the good players, you're not going to intimidate them. They'll come back just as hard the very next shift. And that's what Guy is. And he's a competitor. He put the pressure on himself to do well. And I remember that when we played the Boston Bruins again in the playoffs, and he would do this for all the teams, but I just remember, with Boston, he would get to it's a 7:30 game, and, I think we had to be there about 5. Lafleur would get there about 2, and then he would get dressed and tighten his skates up, put his full gear on, sweater, everything, and he'd be in the trainer's room by 3 o'clock, and he would close the door, and he would concentrate and meditate and think about what he had to do when that puck was dropped for game time. He'd get himself prepared to do what he had to do to win and not take a step backwards. And I remember it'd be like we go on the ice at 5 minutes to 7 for warm-ups. And so 2 minutes before we go on the ice, Bowman would come into the dressing room and do a little talking. And so 3 minutes before, we go on the ice, a minute before Bowman would get there, we'd knock on the trainer's door and Lafleur would know, okay, it's time to come out of there. And when he opened that door, it was in our dressing room, you would not believe the cigarette smoke that came out of there. It was unbelievable how many smokes he had in there. And you kind of say, how could that guy be so good? And look how much he smokes. But, I don't even know if anybody today smokes. But back then, the Montreal Canadiens, they drank lots of beer. And you had the guys that smoked. So, anyways, I can't say enough about Lafleur as a hockey player and as a person. He never bragged about himself, and he was always a great, great teammate to everyone. We were owned by Molson Canadiens back then, and every second weekend, you'd open your front door to your house, and there'd be 2 2-4s of Molson Canadiens left on your door. They would keep us stocked in beer, which was pretty nice.
And you don't even drink beer.
Well, I don't drink much of it for sure. I'm sure I didn't have any problems giving it to some of the teammates that like to drink beer.
So I have a question for you. What was it like not knowing French in Montreal? Was there kind of a French contingent of players that hung around each other? And also, how did the media treat the players that didn't speak French?
Well, I tell you, the media, to me, they were very good. They were French media for the most part. And they were so polite, and they were classy. They realized, I mean, I'm an English guy from Winnipeg. I took 10 years of French in school growing up in Winnipeg. Some of my best friends were French. I was so bad in French that I'll never forget it. In grade 10, the French teacher came up to me and said to me, "Cam, we will pass you this year in French if you promise not to take it next year." So I said, deal. So, yeah, the players, there was a lot of French players on the team, and what they would do is if there was the French players just talking to each other and it had nothing to do with the team, they would just talk French to each other. And it had something that all of us should be involved in. They would speak English. And so I loved that team. I loved all the players. They were classy. They were real teammates, and there was nobody. Unlike some other teams I played for where players are out for themselves, this was a true team. It's interesting when you play for the Canadiens. The fans love this hockey team. They know all the players, and if you go out, the fans definitely come over and ask for your autograph. If you go to the bar, you got to behave yourself because the fans know who you are. And it was so interesting. So if a couple of us went out night before a game, 2 nights before the game, to a bar in Montreal, let's just make this up. So let's say I had, 2 beer and a shooter. And then went to another bar a little while later and had, another beer and a shooter. The next morning, you would come in your dressing room, and there'd be a note in your stall that it'd say, "Go see Scotty." So you go to see Scotty, and he'd say, "Well, Cam, last night you were seen in the bar Thursdays. You had 2 beer and a shooter. And then you were seen over at the bar called Fridays, and then you had another beer and a shooter." The fans would phone and tell on you. Like, they loved their hockey team, and they wanted us to win. And they would phone all the time, and it was quite regular. You had to go see Scotty because he knew exactly what you were doing the night before or 2 nights before. So some of the guys who I'll leave nameless, they were sneaky. They'd go to quieter little bars and try to blend in, and they'd still, poor Rick Sharchuk, because Rick was single living in New York City, or living in Montreal, and he wasn't as sneaky as some of the other single guys, so he got more trouble than anybody.
I think it's 40 years later he can name it.
No, I'm not naming anybody, no. So, that was always interesting. And I remember Kenny Dryden. There was, where I lived, Kenny was nearby, Lafleur was nearby, Guinea was nearby, Robinson, and Corwin Lemaire. We all kind of lived in the same area, so we would carpool all the time. And quite often Dryden would pick me up in the mornings for when we go to our charter or we, fly in commercial airlines. And he had and I want to say it was like a 64 Comet. It was an older car in good shape. So he'd pick me up. And the damn thing, though, was whenever we'd be gone for a day or two and you'd come back to the airport, Kenny needed a new battery. Kenny was so cheap, he never would go spend money on a battery. He always had his booster cables. So, I'm in a hurry to get back. Well, Kenny's car wouldn't start. But all he had to do is he'd pull out his booster cables out of his trunk, go stand in front of his vehicle with his booster cables. The first car that goes by, they go, "That's Kenny Dryden." So we never had any problems getting people to boost. But I almost went out and bought, Kenny a new battery. But he made a lot more money than me, so I was determined he was going to buy his own battery. One of the things with Montreal, they've won like 24 championships, which is probably more than any other team in any other sport. They work hard on the ice. That's one thing, is the practices were hard, and you're taught that you play the same way you practice. So if you float in practice and you say, okay, now I'm going to work in the game, it doesn't work that way. So every day in Montreal, we scrimmaged every single day, even if it was only for 5 or 10 minutes. And it was just like a game. Take the body, keep your head up. So when the practices were over, we'd usually start skating about, say, 10 in the morning. And then us Black Aces had to stay a little bit longer on the ice and had to get on before anybody else. And then we had to do the weights, the stationary bike after. So let's say across the street, and I don't know if I think it was called the Brasserie, but there was no women allowed in it. And so none of the guys were on any ego trips. Every day we'd say, well, let's go for a beer together. And we would go across the street more or less from 1:30 till about 5:30 every single day when we were in Montreal. And we sit around a round table at the bar, and you didn't have to drink. Nobody made you drink. We wanted you to show up. So if you weren't a drinker, you were just expected to buy a round when it came your turn. Nobody put the pressure. We wanted you there because you were a teammate, and we got to know each other. And we used to play what's called bullshit poker with dollar bills when they had dollar bills. We did this every day, and we hung around off the ice, and we played as a team on the ice. So it was no accident that this team has been successful. And it was, the older guys that kind of passed along the ways to the younger guys, and it was a tradition that we would hang together. And then if you look at the New York Rangers, when I was there, they hadn't won the Cup in over 50 years. And when we would say, well, let's go for a beer after practice or a sandwich or something, you'd get 3 or 4 guys that would show up. And you'd get the Swedes would go hang with the Swedes, and the Finns would go hang with the Finns. And we had some married guys whose wives wouldn't let them go out for a beer with the teammates. And then we had the guys, single guys in New York City would head back to New York City. And so we didn't hang around as a team off the ice, and we didn't play as a team on the ice. So something to learn about that. I think it's so important that you get to know your teammates, not just at the rink. One of the funnier stories, though, this one is, I've never heard anything like this before. Kenny Dryden was the number 1 goalie. He had been the number 1 goalie for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. He was unbelievable goalie. And Bunny Larocque, I believe he was a first rounder. But when you are behind Kenny that plays 70, 80% of the games, and you're the practice goalie, and there's no team that shoots the puck at the goalie more in practice than the Canadiens. Those goalies see so much rubber. And if you hit a goalie in the face in practice, most goalies, they'll chase you around the ice, going to hit you with their stick, and they're all mad. With the Canadian goalies, they were there to stop pucks. You hit them in the head, in the face, they just shook their head, shook it off, got right back in net. They were true goalies. And so if you go down and shoot on Ken Dryden, out of 10 shots, maybe you'll get 1 or 2 on Kenny. He was that good. But you go down to Bunny, because Bunny's had way too much rubber shot at him. He just wasn't as good as, when you're the backup. So he probably didn't even care if he stopped it in practice. We could go down and without any lie, score 9 out of 10 on Bunny. So here we are, we're playing the Bruins in the playoffs, and the traditional way it works, okay, day of the game, Dryden's playing, go off the ice after this morning skate, Bunny would stay out, and so this was a typical, Kenny went off, Bunny stayed on the ice for extra shots from the players that were staying on the ice, and so that night, Bowman come in the dressing room 2 minutes before, and he gives the pep talk, and we had to win this game. If we lost this game, our season was over. The Bruins were leading the series. We had to win this game. Now, Kenny hadn't been playing the way Kenny could during the playoffs against the Bruins, but even a Kenny that wasn't playing as good as, and I'm not knocking Bunny, believe me, he was a wonderful teammate, but even Kenny not playing as well would do better than Bunny would do just because he just didn't get that extra game time, and so he wasn't as sharp as he used to be. So we're about to go on the ice, and Bowman gives the little pep talk, and then he said, Bunny, you're out. Let's go. You're starting. And you can't say, Bowman, are you kidding me, man? Like, you can't say anything. This is our teammate. But we looked at each other going, oh, my God. So as we're going out through the ice, Bunny Larocque, he turned white. And Kenny, he didn't say a word. He wanted to play, but he just kept classy and quiet. This was Bowman's decision. So Bunny was leading us out there. Some of the guys were saying, okay, in the warm-up, you start and you shoot from the blue line, and then as he's warmed up a bit, you come in and shoot from the slot. So they said, well, look, when you were warming him up, guys, aim for his pads. Give him some confidence. So we're shooting from the blue line, and we're scoring. The guys are scoring on him. And they went, oh, my God. So it wasn't looking good. And Rick Chartraw, he was upset. And I was standing right there, and he come over to me and he said, "No effing way that Bunny's playing tonight." I didn't know what that meant. Anyways, it was Shardy's turn to shoot on Bunny. He went into the slot, and if you look at Rick's, his wrists were the size of most people's ankles. He could shoot a puck. He got into the slot. He let a wicked slap shot go, hit Bunny right between the eyes with a slap shot and knocked him out. So the trainer comes running on the ice and puts the smelling salts under Bunny's nose, and he says, Bunny, are you okay?" And Bunny kind of looked up and he said, "No, I'm not." And then the trainer said, "Could you play tonight?" And Bunny said, "No, I can't." So Dryden came into net. He stood on his head that night, and without him being in that net, I would not have this Stanley Cup ring on my finger right now. So that is pretty unusual. I've never heard anybody knocking a goalie out in a warm-up because he didn't want him playing. But thank you, Rick Chartraw.
So as you can hear, my dad's been sharing lots of stories, but we didn't want this to go too long, so we are going to end this episode now, and we will continue this with part 2 in a week. And part 2 is not to be missed. He shares some epic pranks that were played in the Montreal Canadiens locker room, including someone that kept getting hot ice in their jockstrap. That's a good story. The story that you have to tune in for is to hear what happened to former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, what my dad did to him in the Montreal Canadiens locker room after the Stanley Cup. I can't believe it. We'll see what you all think. And also Cam shares what he felt like when he won the cup, and also how he felt when he found out that his name was not going to be on the Stanley Cup, and what his teammates did to ensure that his name was on the cup. So it's an interesting part 2 coming up. So I hope you listen, and maybe we'll get that tennis game in and we'll report back to see who won.